How, if some day or night a demon were to sneak after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, "This life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more, and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything immeasurably small or great in your life must return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment, and I myself. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned over and over, and you with it, a dust grain of dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or did you once experience a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more godly"? If this thought were to gain possession of you, it would change you as you are, or perhaps crush you. The question in each and every thing, do you want this once more, and innumerable times more, would weigh upon your actions as the greatest stress. Or how well disposed would you have to become to yourself and to life to crave nothing more fervently than this ultimate eternal confirmation and seal. Okay, so a quote from The Gay Science, which is excerpted in your portable Nietzsche book. It's on page 101 to 102, and it's a way of introducing the main theme for this video, which will be the 6th video in our series on Friedrich Nietzsche for our existential psychology class. And the theme is going to be the Eternal Recurrence and also Amor Fati. Okay, so these two themes are definitely going to be interwoven, and as we get into it, probably you'll gain an appreciation for that. But first thing, besides our introductory reading, last video I forgot my hat of the day to keep my hair under control. But so here it is, hat of the day. This is actually a hat from a friend's farm who lives not too far from here, and so I'll wear this in his honor, at least partially. So, the Eternal Recurrence, okay, big theme in Nietzsche's work. In fact, it's a theme that he retrospectively identified as the centerpiece of his entire philosophy, this idea of the eternal recurrence. But let's introduce a little bit of vocabulary first before we get into what this thing means. So, vocabulary. Because Nietzsche is translated for us English speakers, it's the eternal recurrence is also known as the eternal return. So if you see that phrase, it's the same thing. Or the eternal return of the same. Okay, so all these things are pointing to the same basic idea. And at first it can be pretty tough to see why Nietzsche would name this idea as sort of the crowning moment in his entire corpus of works, because basically what it is the idea that time might be structured circularly in some sense instead of linearly the way we normally think about it. So the eternal recurrence is the idea that perhaps at some level of description things proceed as they are and bend back upon themselves in a way where the entire sequence occurs again and again and again eternally. Okay, so the eternal recurrence, the idea that time might be structured circularly. So obviously this begs interpretation, because it's not at all clear, at least at first, why Nietzsche would regard this as an important feature of his philosophy. So there are a couple different interpretations of them. I made note briefly of two of them in your notes, but the third one is the one I really want to expand upon today. But let's note the other two briefly. So in the book entitled The Will to Power, now let's remember what we said about that book in the last video. So what we said was that this was a posthumous collection of his notes rather than a book that he wanted to put out as representative of his thought. So there's always a little bit of dubiousness whenever people are quoting the Will to Power book. Okay, but at any rate, in the Will to Power book, he spends some time expatiating on the extent to which the eternal recurrence might be reflected in the physics of the day. Okay, so the physics of the day, you have to remember, is late 19th century physics. We were just heading toward the theory of relativity at that point, not too far away from it historically, but still prior to the theory of relativity. So he's sort of wondering about that and, speculating about it and so on, which makes it seem like, well, maybe this eternal recurrence is almost a physics type idea. In other words, a theory about how time itself is structured. Okay, the second way of interpreting it is as that it's not really all the events of the universe or of your life in the universe that are repeated in a circular fashion over and over, but that it's the main themes, the main motifs, like life itself giving birth to life itself. Life feeds on life, and I'm quoting the band Tool a little bit for those who might be fans, possibly. It's a little bit old school now, but I still love them at any rate. So, the idea that it's the main thematics of life that occur again and again, a little bit like it says in the Bible, nothing new under the sun. That's from Ecclesiastes. For those keeping track of the biblical references, at any rate, that's another interpretation of this eternal recurrence idea. And let me read a little quote from your book that might support that. Let's see, is this the right one? Yes, 329, near the bottom. So Zarathustra is having a conversation with his two animals, the eagle and the snake, and so the animals say, "O Zarathustra," the animals said, "to those who think as we do, all things themselves are dancing. They come and offer their hands and laugh and flee and come back. Everything goes, everything comes back, eternally rolls the wheel of being." Everything dies, everything blossoms again, eternally runs the year of being. Everything breaks, everything is joined anew. Eternally, the same house of being is built. Everything parts, everything greets every other thing. Eternally, the ring of being remains faithful to itself. In every now, being begins. Round every here rolls the sphere there. The center is everywhere. Bent is the path of eternity. Okay, so that's on page 329 and 330, which is the third part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is where that quote comes from. So that would be an illustration of that second interpretation. But like I said in the beginning, the one I really want to spend time on is the last, because it's the most interesting, I think, by far, interpretation. And the trick you have to get at this point is, from this point of view, the eternal recurrence is a kind of thought experiment. Okay, so what's a thought experiment? It's a way of moving in your mind, in your thinking, that hopefully reveals some new insight. So it's not really a declarative theory about the structure of temporality like physics would have, and it's not even a kind of proclamation about the cyclicity of the main thematics of life or anything like that. Instead, it's a kind of a thought that you might run through your mind with the expectation that you might discover something important about life. Okay, so it's a thought experiment, and it's going to be related to this idea of Amor Fati. Now, if your Latin is a little bit rusty, let me translate that phrase for you. So it means, well, literally it means love of fate, but in a more, I guess, loose and approximate way, he's talking about love of life. So he's talking about the question of whether we love where fate has cast us, right? In other words, human existence. Like, do we really love life? Now, this is a question that is probably easy to answer yes to. Well, of course, well, I love life. Well, why do you love life? Well, there's lots of cool stuff in it, and all you have to do is sort of look to all the positive elements of things you've experienced in your life to find an answer that's in the affirmative to Amor Fati, which is a question like, do you love life? And in other words, like you count up like all the great pizzas you've eaten, and you know, all the times your team won the game and you felt so happy, and you know, all the times that you won some great victory in your life, or you got a promotion, or you count up all the orgasms you've had, and it seems like it would be very easy to say yes to this question. But here's the trick. Nietzsche means for this to be a real question, which means you not only can acknowledge all the stuff that's on the positive side of the scale, but you also have to acknowledge all the stuff that's on the negative side of the scale. So what would that mean? Well, you'd have to look to all the times when you were like sick as hell. You know, in my own personal experience, one of the physically most difficult times in my life was when I got food poisoning, one of the most painful things and to get through, and I thought I was going to die like at that point. And okay, so can you ask that question, do you really love life, in this sort of thought experiment type way? Like, could you stand the idea that if everything were structured circularly, you would repeat all the moments of your life, and when you look to when you had food poisoning, or you look to something that you deeply regret in your life, that you acted like whatever, a horse's ass or something like that, like could you withstand an infinite repetition of that? All the most painful moments, all the most difficult and humiliating, suffering type moments of your life, could you stand for that to be repeated infinitely? Okay, so, and Nietzsche's sort of way of framing the question is, for you to claim that you really love life, you'd have to be able to affirm all of it, and the possibility that all of it could be repeated infinitely. Like if you were really in love with life, you would want all of it to be repeated infinitely. And maybe, you know, at this point you can sort of almost begin to anticipate where some of this argument is going to be going, you know, because once again there's going to be a critique of the dominant, mostly Christian way of seeing, you know, life and the structure of life and sort of the cosmology in which it fits and all of that kind of stuff. So if you were able to really say yes to life, you know, in the spirit of Amor Fati, then this thought experiment of the eternal recurrence would be one in which, you know, you'd have to sort of pass through that to see if you really do love life. Because if you're really hoping for something other than life as you know it, then the eternal recurrence would probably fill you with horror and fill you with disgust. The idea that you would have to repeat all the most difficult, most painful moments of your existence infinitely, right? So then hopefully at this point you're getting a sense for how difficult in a way this eternal recurrence idea is, right? And in fact, Nietzsche, in the quote that I started this video out with, calls it the greatest stress. Elsewhere, he calls it the greatest weight. In other words, it's the way of speculatively wondering about how life might be structured that would be the most difficult one to affirm. Okay? The hardest one to affirm. The idea that you would have to repeat your life over and over and over. Kind of like in that movie Groundhog's Day a little bit, except even in that movie there was some variation between repetition and repetition, because otherwise it'd be, for most of us, an intolerable movie for the same exact thing to be happening for 2 hours, much less eternally, which is what Nietzsche is suggesting with the eternal recurrence. Okay, so what he means for this is for it to be a real challenge, this eternal recurrence, like the greatest weight. Okay, so let's contrast it with some other ways of viewing what life might be like. Okay, so the dominant Christian one is that, well, your life is a kind of test to see if you can be saved by the blood of the Lamb. Let's say it that way. You know, in other words, you can accept Jesus as your personal Savior and Redeemer of your sins and all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so, well, from Nietzsche's point of view, in a way, which, and of course, like the larger framework for that is that depending upon whether you're successful at doing that, you'll end up being judged as being worthy of being in heaven, or on the other hand, being condemned to hell. Okay, and I guess if you're a Catholic, there's a purgatory region that's in the middle there somewhere. But at any rate, let's just say heaven and hell, because that makes it simpler. Okay, so from that point of view, in a way, this life doesn't matter all that much. What really matters is where you're going to spend eternity, all right? and whether you're going to spend it in heaven, which is what you want, or hell, which is what you don't want. Okay, so from that point of view, really, for Nietzsche, that's a way of hoping that you don't have to deal with this life any more than you absolutely have to, like one lifetime and then you're sort of done. One and done, as they say. All right, so you live your one lifetime, you're saved or you're not, you end up in heaven and hell. So the trick is that it's a way of promoting the afterlife, whatever comes in the afterlife, and it's a way of demoting this life. This life matters only in a provisional way, insofar as it'll get you into heaven or help you avoid going into hell. Okay, so in a way, that's not a way of really loving this life. You getting it? Because it's a way of loving where you're going to spend eternity, hopefully, you know, and this life really is, it doesn't matter all that much as long as you're saved, okay? You know, so in a way, Nietzsche finds that there's a kind of detestation of this life in the Christian cosmology. But that doesn't differentiate Christianity from most other organized religious views because, you know, like for instance, from a Buddhist framework, you know, that's, well, we're on this wheel of samsara, okay? So is the wheel of reincarnation relative to your karma. Okay, that's what samsara means. And if you move toward enlightenment successfully enough through different reincarnations, eventually you'll be liberated from this wheel of samsara and you'll enter into nirvana, not the band, okay, but the state, all right? So you'll be liberated from this cycle of reincarnation. Well, it's the same game from Nietzsche's point of view. It's like, well, what it's really about is sort of promoting the importance of nirvana and getting away from this life and demoting this life. This life really only matters insofar as it's part of a chain of incarnations that might eventually lead you to enlightenment and then to nirvana. You getting it? And by the way, it's not even limited just to religious perspectives because there's a secular version of this too. Okay, so if sort of you like to see things in much more secular terms and what you think life is really about is participating in the advent of some sort of, let's say, scientific technological utopia eventually, you know, well, that's the same damn game too, right? Because once again, what really matters is the eventual production of a scientific / technological utopia, and your life as you know it now, which is not utopian. I would say our world state is not utopian. That matters only insofar as it's part of this larger productivity of a utopian state. Well, it's the same damn game. You're not really in love with this life. What you're in love with is your fantasy of a utopian afterlife, in much the same way that from a Christian point of view, what you're in love with is the possibility of being at the right hand of God in heaven. In much the same way that if you're from a Buddhist perspective, what you're really in love with is the possibility of eventual enlightenment, liberation from samsara, and entry into a nirvana type state. Okay, so all of these are different ways, and by the way, there are more of them. That's hardly a complete list of sort of pointing to points of view that are really not about falling in love with this life at all. For Nietzsche, the real challenge is to fall in love with the life that you're actually experiencing. Okay, and because that's what Amor Fati really means. It's not about, well, you know, you're going to sort of nominally say you're in love with this life, but really you're hankering for some kind of afterlife that may or may not come to pass. Who knows? You know, the challenge is to fall in love with what you're actually experiencing. That's Amor Fati. In another Latin phrase, which Nietzsche does not use, but I'm inventing some Latin phrases for him, might be Amor Vitae in Latin, which would be love of life. Okay, so the challenge of Amor Fati is really the challenge of Amor Vitae. So if you've studied Latin, that means like love of life. Okay, so are you really in love with what you're experiencing? Because what seems to be a way of viewing what life is about can be sort of secretly, once again, here's the theme of putting on masks, secretly a way of despising this life and wanting to get out of it, you know? Either by into heaven, or into nirvana, or into a secular utopia. It doesn't really matter, but you're trying to sort of get out of this. And the reason why you're trying to get out of it is because you're not really in love with what you're going through. You're not really meeting the essential challenge of life, which would be Amor Fati. Okay, so, all right, now, from that point of view, what this amounts to is a way of refocusing or inviting us to refocus our attention and our energies on this life as we know it. That's where the action is. Life as we know it is where the action is. Okay, so the rest, it may be interesting speculation, like who knows? Who knows? You know, who knows what happens, you know. That undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. That's not Nietzsche, that's Shakespeare, okay? Who knows what happens there in that undiscovered country? It's a lot of speculation, what dreams may come. When we have shuffled off this mortal coil, more Shakespeare. Okay, you think I'm quoting Zarathustra or something. No, that's Shakespeare from Hamlet. All right. Act 3, Scene 1. Okay, so, all right, so here comes the big kaboom, all right, for this particular video. The question is, how could you possibly live your life in a way where it could endure, or what is the word I'm looking for? It could withstand, that's it. It could withstand this thought of the eternal recurrence, the greatest stress, the hardest way of thinking about how life might be structured. Is there a way of living your life where you would desire nothing more than an infinite repetition of it? You getting it? All right, that ultimate confirmation and seal. And now I'm not quoting Shakespeare, I'm quoting the quote that I read you in the beginning of this video. Okay, is there a way of living your life so that you really could and withstand the idea that you might have to repeat it infinitely, without end? Is there a way of living your life that would be able to withstand that thought? And Nietzsche's answer is, well, first of all, it's not all the cheap answers that you might think of, because maybe the first cheap answer would be, well, yeah, you know, if I were like rich and famous and beautiful and attractive and all of this kind of stuff, like I could easily withstand the thought of the eternal recurrence, okay? Because I would naturally sort of want to live my life infinitely if that were the case. Well, you might harbor some suspicions about whether that's really the case, because, you know, suppose your sort of fantasy is like to be Paris Hilton. Well, if I were Paris Hilton or one of the Kardashians or something like that, like, yeah, then I could easily say yes to this eternal recurrence thought experiment. Well, really, could you? Because, you know, probably if you had to repeat that life infinitely, you'd realize like how shallow and how dumb and how unendurable it really is. Yeah, it looks good on the surface. It looks good because it's easy. But the thing is, the easy life isn't necessarily the life that you would want to live forever, because of the superficiality of it and the shallowness of it and the imbecility of it and so on and so forth. That just being rich and famous and attractive, like being a celebrity, this is sort of the fantasy of celebrity in American culture. It's like, well, you know, if only I could be a celebrity, you know, well, the thing about celebrities is a lot of their times their lives are so shallow that the next thing you hear about them is they're at the damn Betty Ford clinic or something like that. You know, they've got some kind of addictive problem, they have to get over it, or they have some other kind of, you know, untoward circumstances in their life that it's not necessarily how it appears from the outside. So the question is still hanging in the air, like what kind of life would be sustainable under those terms? And here I'd like to inject a quote, not from the Gay Science, not from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, but this is from a relatively early work called The Birth of Tragedy, probably one of the most famous early works of Nietzsche. And at one point in The Birth of Tragedy, he goes, it is only as an aesthetic event that existence and the world are eternally justified. It is, let's repeat it, it is only as an aesthetic event that existence, like your existence, and the world are eternally justified. Okay, so what's an aesthetic event? An aesthetic event is something that embodies a kind of beauty. So the point of your life is not necessarily to be as comfortable as possible. It's not necessarily to be as happy as possible, or for it to be as painless as possible. It's not necessarily for it to be about justice or something like that any more than it's about the lack of justice. That really the only thing ultimately that makes life sustainable under the metric of this eternal recurrence idea is if you can live beautifully enough, with all of the pain intact, with all of the pleasure intact, with all of your defeats intact, with all of your great victories intact, and all of the middle ground. A lot of life is about the middle ground. That whole sort of picture intact. If you could become the artist, a deep enough artist of your own life, then maybe at the end of your life, you would want nothing more than a repetition of what you've just been through. So if at the end of your life, if you were really into this Amor Fati idea and you found out that you would have to go to heaven at the end of your life, it would seem almost like a disappointment. Because really, if you were in love with your life, what you would want is another repetition of what you just went through. It's sort of like, you know, if you go on a ride at Six Flags or a carnival or something like that, and you really love the ride, probably what you want to do is get back in line at the end of it and go on the ride again. If you're really in love with the ride, let's say a roller coaster, that's something I really love. I really love the ones that go like upside down and do corkscrews and all, like astronaut training. I like to pull some G's, baby, when I go to the amusement park. So if you're really in love with that kind of ride, probably when you get done the ride, you're like, oh my goodness, that was so great. And if someone said to you, well, it's time to go to the Hall of Mirrors now, okay, because that's your heaven, it would feel like a disappointment that you'd have to go to the Hall of Mirrors. Well, the same might be true of your life. Like if you were able to enter into the moments of your life in that deep, artistic, aesthetic way, like deeply enough, powerfully enough, then anything that would be different from what you just went through would seem like a disappointment, would seem like a demotion. It wouldn't be what you want. Because if you were really in love with your life, what you would want is another ride. You're on a ride, baby. It's all about a ride. So the question is, how much can you love the ride? That's the essential question of Amor Fati. And yeah, sometimes, you know, when you go on a roller coaster and you feel that sort of weird feeling in your stomach, it's like, my stomach has been left behind somewhere. I don't know where it is, but it's not where I am. And so there can be some pain in rides, or you get jostled back and forth and all of that kind of stuff. And you get scared, get a little bit scared. That's part of the trip too. Like if you're on a ride at a carnival and you get scared, man, that's part of the thrill. That's part of why you go back on it. That's why, like, once you're beyond a certain age, you don't want to go on the little sort of pony thing that you ride, the little pony with the pole and the merry-go-round. That's it. You're riding the damn little merry-go-round. Like, you want to be scared. You want to be jostled around. You want to pull some G's. You want your face to be like stretched back like you're an astronaut. Like all of that kind of stuff. Like you're willing to endure all of that because, you know, the whole adventure of being on the ride is what makes it worthwhile. Well, if you're a deep enough artist in your life, it can be like that sort of ride, okay? Where all of the pain and all of the discomfort and all of the, like you may throw up all that cotton candy, like all of those kind of sensations, you would be able to put your arms around all of that and affirm it anyhow, okay? That you would want another repetition of the same damn ride, even though it scared you to hell. Another repetition of that. Okay, so in a way, it's a way of calling into question all of these, like, well, wouldn't it be cool to get into nirvana or something like that? All of these sort of ways, or like, you know, if you're sort of into the Nordic sort of pantheon, wouldn't it be cool to like go to Valhalla, you know, be sort of carried by the Valkyries? Like, wouldn't that be cool if you're a valiant warrior? Yeah, same damn game. If you were really in love with your life, you wouldn't want to be going to Valhalla or anywhere else. You would want another repetition of what you've just been through. And that is the litmus test. That is the touchstone for whether you're really in love with your life or not. And if you can't really say yeah to that, and he means for it to be a real question, like he means to problematize our ability to say yeah to our lives that deeply. And if we can't do it, it's like, well, maybe that's a point of overcoming. All right. Okay, so the camera turned off. That's once again my reminder to sort of get on. You get so excited talking about Nietzsche. Like, I find him to be a tremendously exciting thinker, you know, for reasons like this, because he cuts into what's real. You know what I'm saying? Like in a really sort of direct, powerful, funny, provocative way. And I hope this is now video number 6, as I said earlier, that you're really far enough in your reading where you're sort of catching the exciting edge of this guy and his response to life and his way of thinking things through and his insights and so on and so forth. So let's put an end to this video. So the essential question of the eternal recurrence is, as a thought experiment, how much do you really love life? And not only that, the more important part of it is, how much could you possibly be in love with your life? All right. And once again, there's this element of a hermeneutics of suspicion. Okay. So he's trying to call into question a lot of the common ways we have of seeing what the point of human existence really is. And he's trying to call them into question in a way where we might become suspicious of whether what seems to be on the surface to be an affirmation of human existence is in reality a deep negation of it. Because if what we really is going on is we're really hoping not to experience anything like what we're already experiencing, well, how much deeper of a negation of life can you come up with than that one? You know, if you really want something radically different, probably what it is not Amor Fati, but Odium Fati in Latin, which means a hatred of fate, a hatred of life. Odium vitae, a hatred of what we're already experiencing. And that's a way of, for Nietzsche, once again, that's a point of possible overcoming and a deeply essential and necessary one. Okay, so it's storming out now. Like, I always take it as a good sign when I'm talking about Nietzsche and it happens to be storming at the time. And it's raining really hard out there and there's some thunder in the distance. I hope you heard it on the beginning of the of this video. In any case, like, have a great day. See if you can live your life in a way today. Come on, ride with this, okay? See if you can live your life today in a way where you could sustain the idea that whatever it is you have to experience, you would have to experience infinitely. And if you can, who knows? Maybe you're really in love with your life. Have a good one. Bye-bye.